In the previous video, we talked about the development process. And the development process is really where it all starts. That's where change happens. That's where the innovation happens. That's where our development teams are writing code and maintaining code that is required for the business application to become a reality. So it's a very important process. However, moving from a traditional approach where we have a slow release cycle into a much more DevOps agile approach where we have a much shorter release cycle takes some effort. And it requires ultimately an investment in time and effort to make sure that developers can pretty much do what they're doing before, but build in elements of what they do so that they can become automated. So automating the testing of their code, automating the reviews of the quality of the code, and so on and so forth. So performance of the production application is super critical because if the application runs slow, it's bad enough if it's an internal application, but if it's a public-facing application, like a website, then if the application runs slow because you haven't taken care of performance, that means you've got a lot of latency, people get frustrated and start thinking about, okay, let me look for an alternative because this isn't really cutting it, it's too slow. And so, yes, monitoring performance is really important, and monitoring the database performance is actually where most of the application performance problems come from. The main challenges of monitoring a database environment in DevOps pipeline is a lot of the traditional approach to monitoring databases tends to be focused on the production database, which is fine, not saying don't monitor your production database because that's super important. But in DevOps pipeline, you could actually use monitoring tools to mitigate the risks of these changes now they're happening faster and make sure that we're not missing any likelihood of performance impacts, scalability impacts, impacts due to changes in the database structure that might then cause a problem in production. It gives us an opportunity to do scalability testing and monitor the impacts of those before we go into production. In other words, it helps to mitigate any risks of the unforeseen before you commit them to your live production database. If you're not monitoring your database environment in your DevOps pipeline, then you're assuming that everything is fine and you're ready to deploy all these changes you've just made into your production environment. But unbeknownst to you, you might have introduced some issues when you made those changes way back in the development phase. For example, you might have modified an SQL statement, and therefore when that statement runs in a production application, that transaction is now running slower than it was before. But because you're running in an environment where you've got a lot more data, a lot more users, the effect of that is amplified significantly. And next thing you know, you've got significant latency in an application because of something that somebody changed and you never captured it. So that's the downside. It's all about risk mitigation. We have a solution in Quest Software, it's called Foglight for Databases, and it's a 24/7 database monitoring tool. It works against many of the mainstream database vendors, Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, DB2, MySQL, as well as some of the NoSQL databases that are becoming more popular, such as MongoDB and Cassandra. It enables you to monitor, like I said, not just your production database, but all of your databases in your non-production environment as well, and identifies any potential problems. And the way it does that, it enables the DBA, the database administrator, to set some workload profiles. What is the normal behavior that a DBA would expect to see in that database? And then any resource consumption that goes outside of that profile is brought to the DBA's attention through an alert. And that alert is raised inside of a dashboard. So the DBA sees a very high-level dashboard that shows them all of the databases they're monitoring, regardless of which type of database it is or where it is. It can be in the data center, it can be in the cloud, it doesn't really matter. And then see a visual alert. And that visual alert will tell them in real time that something has happened on a particular database, and then the DBA can then drill into more detailed screens and effectively triage the root cause of that problem in fine detail really quickly. Once they understand what it is, then they can understand what they need to do to resolve the problem. The key thing is they fix that problem before it ever got to production. The ROI of this is, if you look at the downside of not monitoring your databases and you've got an unforeseen performance problem happens, either a scalability issue or just a transaction that's now running slower, you might end up at best with slow latency on your application, but at worst it could cause a data corruption, it could cause a major outage. And when we consider these days a lot of applications in financial services and what have you, costing thousands of pounds every minute that that system is down, that's going to add up to a lot of money really quickly. So if you can do something to mitigate that risk, then you minimize any chance of that happening. So with Foglight for database, it's a very easy application. You get up and running, you connect to all of your databases that you have, you see them visibly in a single dashboard, single pane of glass. You can instantly drill down as soon as you start seeing something happen. And in the DevOps pipeline, there's a really cool feature which actually captures the effect of a change. So you've got a baseline deviation capability, which basically if something happens, unforeseen happens, you can compare it historically against something that happened before and see the effect of it. So you basically see the effect of a change. Something changed that deviated from normal behavior, and DBA is instantly aware of what that is, and they can drill down and identify the problem. We had a customer recently that started using Foglight. They had a data warehouse running in production, and they wanted to make sure that they mitigated any risks, any performance impacts. They were embracing DevOps, but they were concerned about the fact that they were making these changes quite rapidly. And what they're able to do by using Foglight was actually set up these thresholds that gave them an indication of any out-of-norm conditions. And it gave them the comfort in knowing that should a problem arise, they could triage the problem really fast and direct the appropriate people to resolve that problem in a very fast turnaround time. And that's really important. It gave them comfort that moving to a more agile approach was a safe thing to do. They weren't risking their production systems because they had the tools there that they could see exactly what was going on. They had full transparency of everything in the process. In the next video, we're going to talk about data movement. And data movement's important in the DevOps pipeline because as we start rolling changes out into our production system, which could be in a data center or it could be in the cloud, you might need to have other replica environments of that database for different purposes. For example, high availability or disaster recovery or a reporting database somewhere like that. So we're going to talk about how do we move the data reliably without any kind of data loss or corruption quickly into some other environment.